The first thing I saw was the glint of the sun on the new steel, a thin, sharp line of silver that hadn't been there 2 days ago, cutting across the base of the dusty hill where the old oak stood. I slowed my truck, the tires crunching on the gravel of my own driveway, a cold knot tightening in my gut. It was a fence, a tall industrial-grade chain-link fence topped with a mean curl of razor wire. It ran in both directions, disappearing behind stands of trees, encircling everything. My home, my barns, my land. My heart hammered against my ribs as I threw the truck into park just feet from the only gate, a heavy, double-wide thing secured by a massive, gleaming padlock. A brand-new, no trespassing property of Pinebrook Meadows HOA sign was bolted to the center. I was locked out of my own life. The shock was a physical blow, leaving me breathless. But that shock began to curdle almost instantly into something colder, something far more dangerous. Quick question. Where are you from? I like to know where my viewers are watching from. A quiet, simmering rage. They thought they had me caged. They thought I would scream or beg or hire a lawyer and get bogged down in their bureaucratic swamp. They had no idea who they were dealing with, because instead of reaching for my phone, I reached for the title deed in my glove box, and I started to form a plan. A plan that didn't involve cutting the lock. It involved buying the very ground it stood on. 40 acres of Texas hill country had been my sanctuary for the past 5 years. I bought the land with a severance package and a lifetime of savings after 25 years as a paramedic in San Antonio. The city's constant sirens and the weight of all the lives I couldn't save had worn me down to a nub. I craved silence. I found it here, on this patch of earth northwest of Fredericksburg, where the only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the live oaks, the distant lowing of my small herd of retired dairy cows, and the contented snorts of my 2 horses, Bonnie and Clyde. The ranch wasn't fancy. My home was a renovated century-old farmhouse with a porch that sagged just enough to feel welcoming. The barn wore a coat of faded red paint that was more memory than pigment. It was perfect. It was mine. For years, my nearest neighbor was Old Man Henderson, a retired geologist who lived a mile down the dusty county road and only ever came by to borrow a tool or share a bottle of Bourseron. We had an understanding, built on mutual respect and a shared desire to be left alone. Then, the bulldozers came. They cleared the vast empty field to the south of me, the one I'd sometimes ride through on weekends. What sprang up in its place wasn't just a new neighborhood, it was a monument to conformity. Pinebrook Meadows. Every house was a variation of beige and gray, every lawn a perfectly manicured carpet of identical grass, every mailbox the same black wrought-iron monolith. It was as if a spaceship had landed and deployed a suburb. At first, it was just a nuisance. The constant hum of landscaping crews, the glare of stadium-bright streetlights that polluted the night sky. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the peace, within my own fence lines. But peace, I was about to learn, was not a concept the Pinebrook Meadows Homeowners Association understood. Their world was built on control. My existence, with its slightly unkempt beauty and defiant independence, was an affront to their carefully ordered universe. The first contact was a letter, so crisp and official it felt like a subpoena. It cited me for a visual blight violation. The offending item? My vintage 1952 Ford truck, a project I'd been lovingly restoring for years, which was visible from the road. They demanded I construct a suitable screening apparatus or remove it from view. I laughed, a short, harsh sound, in the quiet of my porch, and tossed the letter into the kindling box. It was my land. Their rules ended at their property line, or so I thought. The letters kept coming. My barn was the wrong color. My pasture grass was too tall. The wind chime my late wife had given me was deemed an unauthorized auditory nuisance. Each missive was more absurd than the last, each tone more imperious. I ignored them all. I was Jesse Crockett, a man who had held the hands of the dying and brought new life into the world. I wasn't going to be intimidated by a committee with an unhealthy obsession with shrubbery, but then the people started coming. A woman named Ms. Sterling, the HOA board president, appeared one afternoon in a golf cart that was somehow too clean for a dirt road. She wore a polo shirt with the Pine Brook Meadows logo embroidered on the breast and a smile that didn't reach, her cold, assessing eyes. She spoke of community standards, of property values, of the importance of presenting a unified, harmonious front. I told her, in language that was decidedly unharmonious, exactly where she could place her community. Standards. She left, but the pressure didn't. I began to notice cars slowing down as they passed my property, strangers with clipboards taking notes. The feeling of being watched became a constant, itchy presence. My sanctuary was under siege, and the battle. Lines were being drawn not with guns, but with paperwork and petty grievances. The war for my home had begun, and I didn't yet know the first rule of engagement. The official notice arrived on a Tuesday, delivered not by the Postal Service but by a stern-faced process server who handed me the thick envelope without a word, before turning on his heel and driving away. The paper was heavy, expensive stock. The Pine Brook Meadows HOA seal was embossed at the top, a pretentious little logo of a tree and a house. Below it, in stark, uncompromising type, was the word injunction. My eyes scanned the legalese, my heart rate climbing with each paragraph. It wasn't a citation anymore, it was a declaration. The document alleged that my property constituted a public nuisance and a danger to community health and safety. The listed offenses were a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction, unattended. Compost piles that were allegedly attracting dangerous wildlife, uncontrolled vegetation posing a fire hazard, and inadequate perimeter fencing that allowed my livestock to potentially roam. It was all nonsense. My compost was contained, my grass was green but manageable, and my fences were strong and well-maintained. The real kicker, the line that made my blood run cold, was the proposed remedy. Due to the imminent and irreversible nature of the threat, the HOA had petitioned for and been granted an emergency injunction from a county judge. They were authorized to undertake immediate remedial action to secure the community's perimeter. My hands began to tremble. I read the final paragraph 3 times before the meaning fully sank in. They were going to build a fence, not on their property, around mine. They were going to encircle my 40 acres with a security fence, citing some obscure county ordinance about containing agricultural nuisances. The injunction claimed that since my land was now encapsulated by the development, I was effectively a threat within their gates. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. They were going to put a cage around my life and call it compliance. The notice stated that work would commence within 48 hours. I stood there on my porch, the paper shaking in my hand, the peaceful sounds of my ranch suddenly feeling fragile and precious. This was no longer a war of letters. This was an invasion. Panic surged, hot and acidic, but my paramedic training kicked in, assessed the situation, prioritize, act. I called my lawyer, a sharp woman named Linda Garrity in Fredericksburg who handled property law. I read her the injunction over the phone. There was a long silence on her end. When she spoke, her voice was tight, concerned. She said the judge who signed it, Judge Henry McCall, had ties to the development company that built Pine Brook Meadows. She said fighting it would take time, money, and a mountain of motions. Time was the one thing I didn't have. The wheels were already in motion. The next 36 hours were a blur of frantic phone calls, futile emails, and growing despair. Linda filed an emergency motion to stay the injunction, but the court clerk said it would be days before it could be heard. I drove to the county courthouse myself, but was politely yet firmly turned away. The system was locked up and they held all the keys. I had to leave for 2 days. My sister in Houston was undergoing a scheduled surgery and I had promised to drive her home and help her get settled. It was the worst possible timing. A deep, primal dread settled in my stomach as I packed a bag. I asked Old Man Henderson to keep an eye on the place, but he was away visiting his grandkids. I was leaving my home undefended. The drive to Houston was a tense, miserable journey. Every mile that clicked by on the odometer felt like a betrayal. I called Linda twice for updates, but there were none. The HOA was following the letter of their legal permission, however corruptly it had been obtained. When I finally returned, 2 days later, exhausted and worried, the first glimpse of that silver steel fence felt like a physical punch to the chest. They hadn't wasted a minute. The cage was complete, and the only gate in or out was locked tight, with a padlock that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. The notice had promised a key would be provided for reasonable access once I signed a document agreeing to a list of new draconian rules and acknowledged the HOA's authority over my land. The key was the bait. My freedom was the price. I stood there staring at that lock, the Texas sun beating down on my back. The anger that had been simmering for months finally boiled over, but it was a cold, clear, focused anger. They had made a critical mistake. They thought this was about compliance. They thought I would break. But as I looked at that fence, I didn't see a barrier. I saw a boundary. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that every boundary has two sides. They had just shown me theirs. It was time to find out who really owned the line. The first night was the worst. I slept, or more accurately, lay awake, in the cab of my truck, parked just outside the gate. The interior of the ranch was dark, a silent, shadowy kingdom I could see but not touch. My animals were in there. My home was in there. Were they okay? Had the crews scared them? Was there enough water in the troughs? Every rustle of the night, every call of a distant coyote felt like a taunt. The helplessness was a suffocating weight. At dawn, I was greeted by the sight of a Pine Brook Meadows security vehicle, a white SUV with tinted windows, parked 100 yards down the road. A silent, watchful sentinel. My every move was being monitored. I needed a plan, and I needed to not look like I was making one. I drove into town, forcing a calm I didn't feel. I went to the diner, ordered coffee, and made a show of looking frustrated and defeated. I let people see me. I wanted the narrative to be that Jesse Crockett was beaten. Meanwhile, my mind was racing. The fence was on their property line, that much was clear. They hadn't trespassed to build it. They had used the legal easement along the perimeter, the same one the power company used. But the gate was the access point. Where exactly was it situated? I needed a survey map, and I needed it yesterday. I called Linda from a payphone, a paranoid impulse, but I was starting to suspect my cell phone wasn't private. I asked her to get me the most recent plat maps and property deeds for both my land and the Pine Brook Meadows development. She promised to have her assistant pull them from the county records. The waiting was agony. To kill time and maintain my cover, I visited the local feed store and complained loudly to the owner, Sam, about my predicament. I played the part of the aggrieved rancher, all bluster and no plan. Sam nodded sympathetically, but then he lowered his voice. "You're not the first, Jesse. Old man Peters, who used to own the land west of here. They did something similar. Drove him right off his property. He said they used loopholes. Lots of them. A cold chill went down my spine. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a tactic. Later that afternoon, I parked on a high bluff that overlooked the backside of my property, using binoculars to scan the fence line. That's when I saw it. A small prefabricated shed, painted in drab green, had been erected just on the other side of the fence, near the gate. It was unmarked, but it had a heavy-duty hasp and a padlock identical to the one on the gate. A maintenance shed, or a key shed. The pieces were starting to click together into a terrifying picture. This was premeditated. The HOA, or the developers behind it, had a playbook for this. They would identify a holdout property, use legal maneuvers to justify an enclosure, and then wait for the owner to either give up or go bankrupt trying to fight it. They would then acquire the land for a fraction of its value, expanding their perfect, controlled little empire. My ranch was the last missing piece in their puzzle. Linda called me that evening. Her voice was tense. She had the maps, and she had found something. The gate and the shed weren't on the main Pine Brook Meadows property. They were on a tiny, separate half-acre parcel of land that jutted out like a peninsula right at the point where the county road met my driveway. According to the deed, that little sliver of land had been sold to the Pine Brook Meadows HOA just 3 weeks prior by a holding company called Silver Oak Holdings, LLC. They had bought the one piece of land that controlled access to my entire world. It was a masterstroke of malicious ingenuity. They owned the moat and they owned the drawbridge. I was the prisoner in the tower. The despair threatened to swallow me whole. But then, looking at the map, another thought occurred to me. A dangerous, outrageous, glorious thought. If that land could be bought once, could it be bought again? The HOA owned it. But what if someone else made them an offer? What if that someone was me? The risk was enormous. If they found out I was trying to buy it, the price would skyrocket, or they'd simply refuse out of spite. It had to be done in secret. It had to be done through a shell corporation, a third party, a ghost. I needed a buyer they would never suspect. I needed a miracle. And as I sat there in the growing darkness, a name floated up from the depths of my memory. An old friend from my paramedic days, a man who had left the chaos of the city for the chaos of high-stakes real estate. A man who owed me a favor that could never be repaid. I picked up the phone, my hand steady for the first time in days. The game had just changed. What would you do if this happened to you? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. The first night was the worst. I slept, or more accurately, lay awake, in the cab of my truck parked just outside the gate. The interior of the ranch was dark, a silent, shadowy kingdom I could see but not touch. My animals were in there. My home was in there. Were they okay? Had the crews scared them? Was there enough water in the troughs? Every rustle of the night, every call of a distant coyote felt like a taunt. The helplessness was a suffocating weight. At dawn, I was greeted by the sight of a Pine Brook Meadows security vehicle, a white SUV with tinted windows, parked 100 yards down the road, a silent, watchful sentinel. My every move was being monitored. I needed a plan, and I needed to not look like I was making one. I drove into town, forcing a calm I didn't feel. I went to the diner, ordered coffee, and made a show of looking frustrated and defeated. I let people see me. I wanted the narrative to be that Jesse Crockett was beaten. Meanwhile, my mind was racing. The fence was on their property line. That much was clear. They hadn't trespassed to build it. They had used the legal easement along the perimeter, the same one the power company used. But the gate was the access point. Where exactly was it situated? I needed a survey map, and I needed it yesterday. I called Linda from a payphone, a paranoid impulse, but I was starting to suspect my cell phone wasn't private. I asked her to get me the most recent plat maps and property deeds for both my land and the Pine Brook Meadows development. She promised to have her assistant pull them from the county records. The waiting was agony. To kill time and maintain my cover, I visited the local feed store and complained loudly to the owner, Sam, about my predicament. I played the part of the aggrieved rancher, all bluster and no plan. Sam nodded sympathetically, but then he lowered his voice. "You're not the first, Jesse. Old man Peters, who used to own the land west of here, they did something similar. Drove him right off his property. He said they used loopholes. Lots of them." A cold chill went down my spine. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a tactic. Later that afternoon, I parked on a high bluff that overlooked the backside of my property, using binoculars to scan the fence line. That's when I saw it. A small, prefabricated shed, painted in drab green, had been erected just on the other side of the fence, near the gate. It was unmarked, but it had a heavy-duty hasp and a padlock identical to the one on the gate. A maintenance shed, or a key shed. The pieces were starting to click together into a terrifying picture. This was premeditated. The HOA, or the developers behind it, had a playbook for this. They would identify a holdout property, use legal maneuvers to justify an enclosure, and then wait for the owner to either give up or go bankrupt trying to fight it. They would then acquire the land for a fraction of its value, expanding their perfect, controlled little empire. My ranch was the last missing piece in their puzzle. Linda called me that evening. Her voice was tense. She had the maps, and she had found something. The gate and the shed weren't on the main Pinebrook Meadows property. They were on a tiny, separate half-acre parcel of land that jutted out like a peninsula right at the point where the county road met my driveway. According to the deed, that little sliver of land had been sold to the Pinebrook Meadows HOA just 3 weeks prior by a holding company called Silver Oak Holdings, LLC. They had bought the one piece of land that controlled access to my entire world. It was a masterstroke of malicious ingenuity. They owned the moat and they owned the drawbridge. I was the prisoner in the tower. The despair threatened to swallow me whole. But then, looking at the map, another thought occurred to me. A dangerous, outrageous, glorious thought. If that land could be bought once, could it be bought again? The HOA owned it. But what if someone else made them an offer? What if that someone was me? The risk was enormous. If they found out I was trying to buy it, the price would skyrocket, or they'd simply refuse out of spite. It had to be done in secret. It had to be done through a shell corporation, a third party, a ghost. I needed a buyer they would never suspect. I needed a miracle. And as I sat there in the growing darkness, a name floated up from the depths of my memory. An old friend from my paramedic days. A man who had left the chaos of the city for the chaos of high-stakes real estate. A man who owed me a favor that could never be repaid. I picked up the phone, my hand steady for the first time in days. The game had just changed. What would you do if this happened to you? Tell me in the comments. I read every Leo Vasquez answered on the second ring. His voice was still a gravelly rumble, a testament to a 2-pack-a-day habit he'd kicked, a decade too late. Crockett? Hell, I thought you'd fallen off the edge of the world. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I laid it out for him, the fence, the gate, the tiny, cursed parcel of land. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, a mind that saw property lines not as boundaries, but as equations waiting to be solved. When I finished, there was a long whistle on the other end of the line. "Jesse, my friend," he said, "they've got you in a pretty box." "I know that, Leo. I need to know if there's a way out. The land's the key, literally, but prying it from an HOA's cold, dead hands? That's a special kind of challenge. They don't think in profit and loss. They think in power and control. They won't sell." My heart sank. But Leo wasn't done. "However," he drawled, drawing out the word, "they might not have a choice." He explained. The parcel was tiny, useless for anything but access. It was likely classified as a utility easement, or a right-of-way. HOAs were nonprofits, and their financials were a matter of public record. If they were carrying debt on the development, which they almost certainly were, and if a generous, unexpected offer came in for a useless sliver of land, a board might be tempted. They could justify it to their members as a smart financial move, generating cash to offset dues. It was a thin thread of hope, but it was something. "I need you to make the offer, Leo, through one of your corporate veils, something they can't trace back to me. I've got a LLC that's perfect. Dormant, out of state, Looks like an investment. Firms snapping up odd lots. What's your number? What's the play? I thought fast. The land was probably worth $5,000, maybe $10,000 in the real world. But this wasn't the real world. This was a chess match. Offer them 50, I said, the number feeling both absurd and necessary. 50,000, Leo choked. For a postage stamp? Jesse, that's insane. It's the price of my freedom, Leo, and it has to be high enough to make their eyes water. High enough to short-circuit their control panel. He was silent for a moment. All right, I'll have the offer drafted and sent by courier tomorrow. No paper trail. But, Jesse, if they say yes, you're out 50 grand for a patch of dirt. And if they say no, I replied, my voice low, I'm out everything. The next 48 hours were an exercise in pure psychological torture. I stayed away from the ranch, sleeping, in a cheap motel room, jumping every time my phone buzzed. I played the role of the defeated man around town, all while my heart felt like it was going to hammer its way out of my chest. I watched the security SUV from a distance, its presence now feeling like a countdown timer. Then, on the afternoon of the second day, my phone rang. It was Leo. He didn't say hello. They took it. The words were so simple, so quiet, they barely registered. What? They took the offer, Jesse. All of it. No negotiation. The board voted unanimously this morning to accept. They're rushing the paperwork through. I slid down the wall of the motel room, landing on the scratchy carpet. A wave of disbelief, followed by a surge of pure, unadulterated triumph, washed over me. They had taken the bait. They were so arrogant, so convinced of their victory that they saw a quick cash grab and didn't think to look behind the curtain. They had no idea they had just sold me the one thing that could destroy them. I was now the proud owner of a half-acre of Texas dirt, a maintenance shed, and the only key to a very large, very expensive fence. The lock was still on the gate, but I was no longer on the outside looking in. I was the landlord, and it was time to start collecting rent. 1. The deed arrived by special messenger. I held the thick envelope, feeling the weight of the paper inside. It was done. I owned the land under the gate. The first thing I did was drive to the county clerk's office and record the deed myself, making it irrevocably public record. Let them find out that way. Let them see their mistake in black and white. Then, with a set of bolt cutters and a heart full of thunder, I drove to my gate. The white security SUV was in its usual spot. This time, I waved as I drove past. I parked right in front of the massive padlock. I didn't bother with the key they might have left in the shed. I wanted the symbolism. The metallic shriek of the bolt cutters severing the hardened steel shackle was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The lock fell to the dirt with a heavy thud. I swung the gate open. The feeling of driving down my own driveway through that opening was a visceral, emotional jolt. I was home. I checked on the animals. They were skittish, but okay. The house was untouched. The first thing I did was install a high-resolution security camera system with cameras covering every angle of the property, especially the gate and my new half-acre. Let them watch. I was done hiding. The reaction from Pinebrook Meadows was not what I expected. There was no immediate confrontation. No angry horde descended upon my gate. Instead, a profound, eerie silence fell. The security SUV disappeared. It was more unnerving than the harassment. It felt like the calm before a storm. A week passed. Then a new letter arrived. This one was different. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, Barton and Reed Law Group, representing the Pinebrook Meadows Development Corporation. The language was cold, corporate, and utterly chilling. It acknowledged the sale of the parcel, but stated that my ownership did not grant me any right of access across the Pinebrook Meadows private road system that now surrounded my property. According to their maps, the only legal access to my new parcel, and by extension to the gate that led to my ranch, was via a private road owned and maintained by the HOA. My gate, my key, my land, was now a landlocked island. I could own it, but I couldn't get to it without their express permission. They had outmaneuvered me. They had anticipated my move and laid a trap within their trap. The letter concluded by offering me a licensing agreement. For a monthly fee of $2,000, I could purchase an access permit to use their roads to reach my gate. The arrogance was galactic. They were going to charge me rent to use my own key. The fury that rose in me was a white-hot flame. I had been so clever, so proud of my secret purchase, and they had just checkmated me with a line on a map I never knew existed. I was back where I started, maybe even worse off. I was $50,000 poorer and now staring at a perpetual extortion racket. I stormed into my office, pulled out the plat maps Linda had gotten me, and spread them across my desk. I traced the road lines with my finger until it smudged. The lawyer was right. The county road ended about 50 feet before my new parcel. The rest of the access was indeed a private road, recently built and owned by Pinebrook Meadows. It was a perfect legal stranglehold. I spent the night in a fog of rage and desperation, poring over the documents until my eyes burned. It was, in the small hours of the morning, my brain fuzzy with exhaustion, that I saw it. A tiny notation on the map of my original ranch, a dashed line running along the northern border, an historical easement. I'd seen it before when I bought the property, but had never given it a second thought. The title report had listed it as dormant or abandoned. It was an old cattle trail, a right-of-way from a century ago that had never been formally vacated by the county. It cut diagonally across what was now the northeastern corner of the Pinebrook Meadows development, connecting my main ranch property directly to a different county road, one they didn't own. My breath caught in my throat. If this easement was still valid, it meant I didn't need their road. It meant they had built their multi-million-dollar suburb directly on top of my right-of-way. The hunter had suddenly become the hunted. The game wasn't over. It had just entered a whole new level. Duh. You think buying that parcel was the right move? Drop your thoughts below. I'm curious what you'd have done. The discovery of the historical easement was a nuclear option, and I had to handle it with care. I couldn't just announce it. If they found out, they'd mobilize their lawyers and judges to have it vacated before I could blink. I needed proof, and I needed to be holding all the cards before I showed my hand. My first visit was to the County Historical Society, a dusty, quiet building that smelled of old paper and nostalgia. An elderly volunteer with kind eyes helped me dig through archives of land grants and century-old property maps. And there it was, a clear, indisputable survey from 1921 showing the Crockett Trail, named after my own great-grandfather, a designated cattle drive path that ran right through the heart of what was now the Pinebrook Meadows Community Garden and Swimming Pool Complex. I made copies, my hands trembling with excitement. Next, I needed a modern surveyor to confirm the easement's existence on the ground and its legal status. I couldn't use anyone local. Word would get back to the HOA in minutes. Linda found me. A firm from 2 counties over, a no-nonsense crew who asked no questions and accepted a hefty cash retainer. They arrived at dawn on a Tuesday. I met them at the Northern County Road where the easement was supposed to begin. We had to work fast. Using the old maps and GPS, they began staking out the path. It was tense, cloak and dagger work. We were trespassing, blatantly and without permission, on HOA property. Every second, I expected a security guard or an angry resident to appear. The surveyor's crew was professional and efficient, but I saw the flicker of unease in their eyes as we passed manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks. We were ghosts moving through a world of order, leaving behind a trail of wooden stakes and red flags that marked a path of chaos. We made it about halfway through the development, staking a line right through the common area, when the first golf cart appeared. It was Ms. Sterling, the HOA president, and two other board members I recognized from their website. Their faces were contorted with a mixture of confusion and fury. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" Sterling yelled, scrambling out of the cart. "This is private property." The lead surveyor, a stoic man named Roy, didn't even look up from his tripod. "We're conducting a licensed land survey pursuant to county authority and historical land records." He handed Sterling a folded document. It was a copy of the 1921 map. Sterling's eyes scanned it, her face paling from red to a sickly gray as she understood. This is absurd. This is meaningless," she sputtered. "This easement is abandoned. It's defunct." "That's for a judge to decide," I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was calm, steady. The sound of it seemed to infuriate her even more. "You're trespassing. I'm calling the sheriff." "You do that," I said, meeting her gaze. "Ask him to come take a look at the historical property records. I'm sure he'll find it fascinating." The standoff lasted for 10 tense minutes. The sheriff's deputy who arrived was a young guy I didn't know. He listened to Sterling's hysterical complaints, and then to Roy's calm, professional explanation. He looked at the old map, then at the new stakes cutting across the lawn. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking profoundly unhappy to be in the middle of a civil dispute. "This is a matter for the courts," he finally said. "Mr. Sterling, they appear to have some documentation. Mr. Crockett, until a judge rules, I'd advise you to cease this activity to avoid disturbing the peace." It was a draw, but we had what we needed. The path was staked. The point was made. The rumor mill of Pine Brook Meadows would be in overdrive by lunchtime. The HOA now knew I had a counter-move. I didn't know what they would do next, but I knew it would be extreme. The stakes had been raised, literally and figuratively. The quiet. War was about to get very, very loud. The retaliation was swift and brutal. The next morning, I was served with another sheaf of papers. This time, it was a lawsuit filed by the Pine Brook Meadows Development Corporation, alleging intentional infliction of emotional distress, trespass, vandalism for the survey stakes, and slander. They were asking for millions in damages. It was a frivolous, scare tactic lawsuit, but it meant I now had to fight on two legal fronts. The legal fees were starting to mount into a terrifying mountain of debt. Then came the secondary attacks. My credit cards were mysteriously frozen. My homeowner's insurance company sent a letter stating they were reviewing my policy due to newly discovered liabilities. I started getting calls from banks I'd never heard of, offering me high-interest loans in a way that felt less like an offer and more like a threat. They were trying to squeeze me financially, to drain my resources until I had nothing left to fight with. The pressure was immense, a constant grinding weight. I felt isolated, paranoid. I stopped going into town. I trusted no one. The only thing that kept me going was the raw, burning need to not let them win. A few days after the lawsuit was filed, I was in my barn, lost in these dark thoughts, when I heard a car slowly approaching on the gravel driveway. I grabbed my rifle, my nerves frayed to a breaking point. It wasn't the security SUV, it was an old, dented sedan, caked with dust. It stopped a respectful distance from the house. The driver's door opened, and a woman got out. She was in her late 50s, with a tired face and kind eyes. She looked nervous, clutching her purse like a shield. I stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held low but visible. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice rough with suspicion. "Mr. Crockett?" she said, her voice hesitant. "My name is Carol Evans. I live in Pine Brook Meadows." My grip tightened on the rifle. Was this some new kind of trick? "What do you want?" "I wanted to talk to you. To warn you." She took a step closer, her eyes darting around as if checking for watchers. "What they're doing to you? It's not right." I didn't lower the gun. "Why are you here?" She sighed. a sound full of weariness and shame. Because I was on the board when this started. The first board, before Sterling and her group took over. I resigned 6 months ago. I couldn't be a part of it anymore. She told me a story then, standing in my driveway, that turned my blood to ice. Pinebrook Meadows wasn't just a development. It was a pet project for a consortium of powerful out-of-state investors. Their business model wasn't just selling houses. It was acquiring all the land, controlling every aspect. My ranch was the last independent parcel. They had a specific plan for it, a championship golf course and a clubhouse that would be the crown jewel of the community, driving up property values for the final phase of homes. My refusal to sell wasn't an inconvenience. It was a multi-million-dollar problem for them. The fence, the lawsuits, the harassment, it was all a coordinated pressure campaign, approved at the highest levels. The HOA board was just a puppet. The real power was with the Development Corporation and their lawyers. "They won't stop, Mr. Crockett," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They have bottomless pockets and friends in every office in the county. They'll bankrupt you. They'll smear your name. She hesitated, looking truly frightened. "They'll do whatever it takes." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, the question hanging in the air between us. "Because my husband died last year," she said, her eyes glistening. "He was a lot like you, stubborn, independent. He would have hated what this place has become. I'm selling my house and moving to be near my daughter. I have nothing left to fear from them." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, unmarked USB drive. "This is everything," she said, holding it. "Out. Board meeting minutes they never filed, emails, financial records, the real plans for your land. It's all here." I stared at the small plastic device. It looked so insignificant, yet it felt heavier than any weapon. This was the ammunition I needed. This was their playbook. "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse. She just nodded, got back in her car and drove away, leaving me standing there with the key to their destruction in my hand. The battle lines had just been redrawn. I was no longer fighting an HOA. I was fighting a corporation, and I finally had their secrets. The contents of the USB drive were a tour into a world of breathtaking corruption. There were emails between Sterling and the development company's CEO discussing the Crockett problem and outlining the fence strategy. There were financial records showing off the books payments to the county judge who signed the injunction. There were architectural renderings of the proposed golf course superimposed directly over a map of my property with a timeline for acquisition and clearing. It was all there, proof. But proof was only powerful if it was used correctly. Taking this to the local sheriff or the county DA felt pointless. The drive itself suggested they were compromised. I needed a bigger gun. I needed to go over their heads. I remembered a name from my paramedic days, a state senator, Senator Robert Lang, whom I'd treated for a heart scare at a charity event years ago. He'd given me his card and told me to call if I ever needed anything. I'd never imagined I'd need to call in a favor like this. I dialed the number on the card, half expecting it to be disconnected. To my shock, he answered himself. I spent the next 20 minutes laying out the entire sordid tale from the first letter to the contents of the USB drive. There was a long silence when I finished. "Mr. Crockett," the senator said, his voice grave, "this is exceptionally serious. What you're describing is organized fraud, conspiracy, and likely racketeering." He told me to make copies of the drive and send one to his office by secure courier immediately. He said he would engage the state attorney general's office. This was now a state matter. A wave of relief so profound it made me dizzy washed over me. The cavalry was coming, but the relief was short-lived. The very next day, the storm I had been waiting for finally broke. It began with the sound of heavy machinery. Not a single bulldozer this time. It was a convoy. 2 bulldozers, a backhoe, and a dozen pickup trucks filled with men in work clothes descended on the northern edge of my property, right where the historical easement was staked. They weren't there to dig. They were there to build. They began, erecting a second fence, this one even taller and more imposing than the first, designed to run parallel to my border and cut directly across the path of the easement. They were going to wall off my legal access before I could ever use it. It was a blatant, illegal act of desperation. They knew I had the easement. They knew I had the drive. This was their last-ditch effort to create facts on the ground, to physically block me before the state could intervene. I stood at my window watching them work, my phone pressed to my ear. I was on with Linda, who was frantically trying to get a judge on the phone for an emergency restraining order. The system was moving too slow. The men outside were moving fast. Then I saw her. Sterling herself, standing off to the side, directing the operation with a smug, triumphant look on her face. She had a radio in her hand and was barking orders. She knew she was breaking the law. She just didn't care. She believed her money and influence would protect her. She believed she was untouchable. That was her final, fatal mistake. The roar of the engines was deafening. The first posts for the new fence were being driven into the ground, the hydraulic hammer pounding like a war drum. They were destroying the easement right before my eyes. I knew what I had to do. It was no longer about legal maneuvers or waiting for help. It was about standing my ground. I walked to my safe and took out the one thing I never thought I'd need on my own land. I loaded it with shells that made a sound like thunder. This ended today, one way or another. I stepped out onto my porch, the weight of the shotgun familiar and foreign in my hands. The autumn air was cool, but a feverish heat pulsed under my skin. The industrial cacophony of the construction was a violation, a brutal soundscape imposed on my peace. I didn't yell. I didn't run. I walked, with a deliberate, measured pace, down my driveway, across the contested strip of land I owned, and onto the edge of the Pine Brook Meadows property where they were breaking ground. I stopped about 50 yards from the nearest bulldozer, planted my feet wide, and raised the shotgun toward the sky. I pulled the trigger. The boom was apocalyptic, a sound that ripped through the mechanical din and silenced it instantly. Every engine died. Every head turned, every eye fixed on me. In the sudden, ringing silence, my voice carried like a cannon shot. "The next one won't be in the air," I shouted. "This is my property line. You are trespassing. Get off my land." For a moment, there was only stunned silence. The construction workers looked at each other, then at Sterling, unsure what to do. Sterling's face was a mask of purple rage. She shoved her way through the men, striding toward me, her radio clenched in her fist. "You're finished, Crockett!" she screamed, spittle flying from her lips. "You just threatened my crew! I'll have you arrested! I'll have you buried!" She kept coming, closer and closer, her personal space invading mine. I didn't move an inch. I lowered the shotgun, not pointing it at her, but letting her see it, letting her understand the line she was crossing. "This is your last warning, Sterling. Turn your machines around and leave." "Or what?" she sneered, now just feet from me. "You'll shoot me? In front of all these witnesses?" That's when the new sounds began. Not the sound of more machinery, but the deep, thrumming rotors of helicopters. 2 of them, news choppers from stations in San Antonio, appeared over the tree line, their cameras pointed down at the scene. Senator Robert Lang had kept his word. He hadn't just called the Attorney General, he'd called the press. Then, from the other direction, came the sirens. Not just 1 or 2 sheriff's cars. It was a convoy, county sheriff, state police, and 3 black sedans that screamed, "Federal agents." Cars skidded to a halt, doors flew open, and a small army of law enforcement poured out, weapons drawn. The scene descended into controlled chaos. The construction workers dropped their tools and put their hands in the air. Sterling stood frozen, her arrogance evaporating into sheer, panicked confusion. A man in a crisp suit with a badge on his belt walked straight up to Sterling. "Donna Sterling, I'm Special Agent Miller with the Texas Attorney General's office. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of a public official, and unlawful land seizure." As the agent read her rights, another agent approached me. I slowly, carefully, laid the shotgun on the ground. "Mr. Crockett," the agent said, his tone neutral. "The senator filled us in. We have the drive. We'll need your statement." I just nodded, my eyes locked on Sterling as the cuffs were clicked onto her wrists. The look on her face was one of utter incomprehension. The system she thought she owned had just turned around and bitten her head off. The agents fanned out, securing the site, ordering the news helicopters to maintain a distance. It was over. The bulldozers sat silent, monstrous relics of a battle that had already been lost. The fence posts they had started to drive were just lonely sticks in the dirt, going nowhere. The victory was total. But as I watched Sterling being put into the back of a squad car, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a deep, hollow exhaustion. The cost had been too high. My peace had been shattered, my savings decimated, my faith in my neighbors destroyed. I had won. But I looked around at the scarred earth, the silent machines, and the circling news helicopters, and I wondered what, exactly, I had won back. The aftermath was a quiet earthquake. The state's investigation unfolded like a meticulously crafted novel with the USB drive as its explosive first chapter. The county judge was impeached and removed from the bench. The development corporation was hit with staggering fines and saw its executives indicted. The Pinebrook Meadows HOA was effectively dissolved and placed under state receivership. The fence around my property was ordered removed at the HOA's expense. The day the work crews came to take it down, I didn't watch. The sound of the metal being dismantled was music enough. I was offered a settlement, a 7-figure sum from the development company's assets to avoid further civil litigation. I took it. The money couldn't give me back the piece they'd stolen, but it meant security, forever. I paid off Leo, paid Linda, and put the rest away. The new board of what was left of Pinebrook Meadows sent a formal letter of apology, signed by residents who claimed they never knew the extent of the corruption. I didn't respond. Forgiveness was a bridge too far. Life on the ranch slowly returned to a rhythm. The sounds of nature began to drown out the memory of bulldozers. But I was different. The easy trust was gone, replaced by a vigilant wariness. I kept the new security system. I kept the shotgun cleaned and loaded. One afternoon, I was repairing a section of my old wooden fence that bordered the development. A woman from the neighborhood, someone I'd never seen before, approached hesitantly. She held out a pie. We all feel so terrible about what happened," she said. I looked at her, then at the perfect golden crust of the pie, a peace offering from a world that had tried to erase me. I nodded my thanks and took it. I didn't eat it. That night, I sat on my porch as the sun set, setting the hills on fire with orange and purple light. The air was sweet with the smell of cut grass and distant rain. In the silence, I could hear a new sound, faint but growing clearer each day. It was the sound of nothing. No lawnmowers, no leaf blowers, no hum of suburban discontent. The HOA was gone, and with it, the strictures that had choked the life out of the place. The new residents, it seemed, had learned to appreciate a little quiet. The fence was gone. The gate was gone. But I had kept the key. It sits on my desk, now a heavy, cold piece of metal. Not a reminder of my imprisonment, but a trophy from a war I never wanted to fight. A warning to anyone who thinks that boundaries are just lines on a map and that a man's home is just a piece of property. They are not, and it is not, and some of us hold the keys to more than just gates.